One of the big mistakes that people make on the spiritual path is they become at odds with their own humanity. Now, this is due to the higher teachings within particularly non-duality in the Eastern spiritual traditions. Now, if we don't understand the non-dual traditions in their truest aspect, we will begin to become at odds with our own humanity. And you see this a lot with people all around the world. Ironically, particularly with people outside of India. Inside India, a lot of people who follow a lot of the non-dual teachings, such as Advaita Vedanta, still have an ability to understand that they are a human and can emote and can relate to other people in just a genuine way. Whereas I see a lot of foreigners particularly who will get the teachings in an incorrect manner and lose their sense of interacting with people and their ability to just emote cleanly because they've taken the teachings of non-duality in a really strange direction, almost too literally, and so they lose their sense of humanity. Now, when you advance on the spiritual path, you'll realize that this is still a game of the ego. It's still a game that the ego is playing, because the ego is becoming a spiritual ego. Look how much I can control myself now. Look how much I don't interact with people. Look how much I don't look at someone in the eye. Look how much I don't identify with the body. This is still a game of the ego. It's just become a spiritual ego. When you advance on the spiritual path, you get over a lot of those things and you are completely fine with who you are. Now, in relation to this, when we look at Western religions, they will make you feel at odds with your own humanity. Now, when I say at odds with your own humanity, in regards to both the non-dual path and the Western religious traditions, what am I talking about? Just our own humanity, our natural inclination for things. So often in a lot of the traditions, there will be this inclination towards sin, right, in the Western spiritual traditions, where you're a sinner from birth and there's nothing that you can do about it, right, except for follow Christ. And this is a completely insane way of thinking, because you should not feel guilty for your own natural inclinations. A lot of the spiritual traditions, particularly in the West, turn things like sex into something that's demonic, as if sex is some sort of bad thing. But newsflash, all of us here right now came into this world through sex, and so it's a beautiful thing. The problem is when we turn sex into something that's very animalistic, and we, again, don't live a life of moderation in that regard, and so it turns into something that's very negative for our life. That's what's really being spoken about in the spiritual traditions. Not that you should just reject sex altogether or reject something pleasurable altogether. For example, if you like pizza, there's nothing wrong with eating a pizza every now and then. But if you're eating pizza 3 meals a day, then don't be surprised if you have some sort of disease that develops within your body and you're a bit sluggish within your mind. Don't be surprised if that happens. So what these traditions are doing too is they're making you feel guilty for these natural inclinations. And then you are at odds with your own humanity, and this inhibits your spiritual practice. Because then it becomes a game of you are never good enough. You aren't worthy. Because you may have had a sexual thought about someone, or because you may have wanted that extra piece of chocolate cake. You know, we turn everything into a game of right and wrong, good and bad. And this, again, comes from the Western perspective of competition and the game of black and white, where there is right and wrong, good and bad, and we turn everything in our life on the spiritual path into that game. And this is a big mistake, because then once you do that, you have this sense of guilt. And you should not have this sense of guilt for the natural inclinations that you have. The whole purpose of spiritual practice is to control those natural inclinations if they are out of control. Not to control them to its nth degree where you don't have them anymore, because good luck with that, because your sexual drive will come back, a thought will come to your mind that may be not in line with how you naturally think, but because of your subconscious, it comes up into your field of consciousness, and then you begin to think about that. Does that mean you're a bad person? Of course it doesn't mean that. Does that mean that if you follow that thought, and then you start daydreaming for hours, that it's kind of captivated you and it kind of has a bind on you, then yeah, that can be the case. It can have a bind on people when they are engrossed by a thought and then they follow that thought and wander off to its nth degree. So this is a very important thing to understand, that you cannot be at odds with your own humanity. And I often say to people, the crux of Eastern spiritual traditions is to not be at odds with your own humanity. Because within the Eastern spiritual traditions, they're not really saying that there is some sort of sin in following these desires and urges that you have, but you will have to face the karma that is the result of your actions. So you will have to face that eventually. And so it's better to practice and minimize those desires and pleasures and curb them to where that they are just in their natural state. Now, a lot of people don't realize how much culture drives those urges. And I always say to people that if you go to an ashram or a monastery for a long period of time, you'll notice that those urges and that begin to subside. And then they say, well, why is that? Well, you've got to actually start to question the culture that you live in. Because if your culture is constantly promoting sex, constantly promoting something in relation to sex, then that is slowly eating away at your subconscious, and then you'll start to mimic those behaviors of that culture and that way of thinking. It's just part and parcel of you are the environment, that old phrase. It's part and parcel with that. Whereas when you disconnect from those sorts of cultures and you come back to a naturalistic culture, then you'll realize that naturally you don't have all of these overly exaggerated sexual fantasies, or you don't have super great urges for a lot of sugar or for speaking a lot. It's the culture that drives that into your mind and makes you become a puppet of their own doing. And so you've got to refrain from that and understand, as Terence McKenna said, that culture is not your friend. It's not your friend in that sense. And when Terence was saying that, he was speaking about sort of the empty commercial culture that the West has become particularly. He wasn't talking about traditional cultures, which usually will have a knowledge system that will explain how to navigate the tricky terrains of our natural inclinations. But it's those empty cultures that are constantly always driving sex or something of that nature into your mind, such as consumerism, then that becomes a problem, right? If you are a victim of consumerism, you're always buying things that you don't need to prop up a system that doesn't serve you. It's, as Jiddu Krishnamurti said, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And that's unfortunately what a lot of us do. We adjust to a profoundly sick society, and then we become a puppet of that culture, and then we begin to defend that. And I've had that on the channel before. I've had that on other social media networks, even speaking with people in private, where I will observe and give my opinion of consumeristic culture, or say the digital world, and then those people get very angry about it and start to defend that without seeing that maybe what I'm saying has some truth to it. And I'm not actually criticizing them, I'm criticizing what it does to people, how sick it makes people. And so that then eclipses their understanding of their own true nature. And so they could never even come to the deeper spiritual teachings of the East. There would just never be a chance. And so one tradition that doesn't shy away from being at odds with your own humanity is Taoism. Taoism says that your natural inclinations are great. They are wonderful. Sex is great. Enjoying a glass of wine every now and again, not going to kill you. Having a disagreement with someone, but then agreeing to disagree is fine. You imagine if the social media tech companies promoted that. It's okay to agree to disagree. But this is what Taoism was always doing. Taoism was always talking about their natural inclinations for sex, for enjoying a glass of wine, for having rice pudding, for example, or just agreeing to disagree without getting into an argument about something. Choosing friendship over conflict is a natural thing that we should embrace. Instead, we make a culture where our opinion matters, where we overinflate our sense of knowing, where we think that we know more than others, so we know what is best for other people. And then you see opinion versus opinion, and it's a conflict. And so Taoism doesn't shy away from any of that. Taoism says that sex is wonderful. But it can inhibit your spiritual path and take you to a dark place if your mind is constantly occupied by sex. And so you need moderation in your life, and you need to bring balance back into your life. And to use yin-yang theory, because we live in a yang-oriented world, when you're constantly active physically and mentally, then you create this type of imbalance within your system, because you're not bringing your mind back into yin and your body back into yin. You're not nourishing the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when you're constantly always in the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, which is yang, the active, then you begin to have an agitated mind. Your emotions begin to become unstable because you're overly active all the time. People then make the mistake of saying, oh, I'm just an anxious person, or I'm an emotional person. But they're none of those. It's just that you've fallen for this yang-oriented focus that a lot of cultures and societies promote. You need to go out there and do this and do that to be somebody, but this is an incorrect way of thinking. You need to bring your mind back into stillness and your body into rest to nourish the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest part of your nervous system, which is the yin aspect of your nervous system. And so once you do that, then you begin to find balance in your life, and your emotions will begin to dissipate. You won't be as anxious, you won't be as stressful, because you're not operating from that super yang orientation of being active all the time. So when you bring your mind back into yin, to use sex as an example, you won't be focused on sex all the time, and you won't have a lot of fantasies, because again, that's a result of being too active, having all of these fantasies within your mind. And so it's easier then not to be at odds with your own humanity. As I said at the beginning, when people discover the Eastern spiritual paths, for example, and they look at, say, non-duality, but then they look at themselves as a person, they see how big the gap is between how we truly are as opposed to how we've become due to society and culture. The conditioning that's been imposed upon us, that's become our samskaras, our subconscious, our subliminal imprints and mental impressions, that becomes our vasanas, our latent tendencies and habitual ways, which then becomes our karma, our actions in the world and our unconscious actions in the world. And so you see the gap is so big. And then you think, well, I'm just not good enough. I'm not worthy of this. And this is an incorrect way of thinking. You are good enough. You do belong. You are worthy. But the way that the world has trained you is to have guilt, to feel sorry for yourself, to feel not worthy, not good enough for these great teachings. But this is an incorrect way of thinking, because you're just at odds with your own humanity. You think that if you have some sort of thought in your mind, say related to sex, that you are a bad person. This is not true at all. Not true at all. That's just the nature of the subconscious, the nature of the mind. Things that we've accumulated, they bubble up every now and again. It's about having discernment, discrimination, viveka in Sanskrit. Can you see it? And as you see it, can you see it begin to disappear like a cloud in a clear blue sky? And that's what the height of awareness cultivation is within the Eastern spiritual traditions. The ability to see that moving phenomenon coming from the subconscious. And then you can just see it just disappear. And that's really what the name of the game is. If you're living with guilt about a lot of things, but you are naturally just a good person, then this is an insane way of thinking. And you have to then question the culture and society that you were brought up in. Now, it also should highlight if you live in a perverted culture and society as well, because sometimes when you live in a perverted society and culture, all they do is talk about sex as if it's the main thing in life. But when you look at how much time and effort sex takes up in your life, it takes up this tiny little amount. But then when you go to places like India, what is the focus within India? Shiva, Vishnu, Brahman. So then you have to question the societies and cultures that you come from. Is the focus in those societies and culture, is it the ultimate reality? Or is it sexual urge? Or is it some sort of political stance that a culture or society has? So then you have to question, is sex and politics and all of these things, is that the focus of your culture? Or is it the ultimate reality? And oftentimes, if it's the ultimate reality, those cultures aren't at odds with their own humanity. And so they can just be themselves, but the culture is not perverted, so it's very traditional. And it is that way because of the understanding that something like sex can get out of control if it's not seen in moderation. And so if you're in a culture that is constantly promoting sex and violence, for example, don't be surprised if that becomes the focus of people's consciousness, of their mindset. And so we can't be at odds with our own humanity. As the Taoist tradition taught, is that none of that is wrong. None of it's wrong. Don't beat yourself up. It's not about beating yourself up. Once you start beating yourself up, then you're on the wrong path. It's about understanding your nature as a human being. Now, in understanding your own humanity, that's how you understand our true divinity within. So it's in understanding our mortality that we understand immortality. It's through this vessel that is the great opportunity we have in life to understand our true nature, which is Atman, which is identical with Brahman. And that's the opportunity of being a human being. It's not about fighting being a human being. Oh, I have this sexual urge, or I want to eat that donut, or I want to have a few extra hours sleep. It's not about being in conflict with yourself. It's about accepting yourself as a human being. And then once you accept yourself as a human being, then you'll begin to peel the layers away to allow the light of Tao or Brahman to shine through you effortlessly without being blocked, without being eclipsed by any sort of guilt within your mind. And then you can just be naturally who you are as a beautiful human being, but you have an understanding that even though you are in this body, you are part of something much greater than a human being. Shanti, shanti, shanti.